By introducing you. Dr. Alex Gamero-Garrido is an assistant professor of computer science. He got his BE in electronics engineering in the University of Simón Bolívar in Venezuela, his MS in technology and policy in MIT, and his PhD in computer science in the University of California in San Diego. His research focuses on the intersection of computer networking systems and public policy with an emphasis on online privacy. His work yields methodologies and analysis that provide empirical evidence on contentious questions in technology policy. And today he's going to talk to us about the interaction between internet and policy, impact on security, privacy, and resiliency. So thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Gamero. And go ahead, please.
Thanks so much for the intro, Veronica. My name is Alex. I am a computer scientist, and I work at the intersection between internet technologies and public policy. And so as Tom suggested, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about my background. And so as you could probably have guessed from that introduction, I was born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela, and I have moved around a lot for the past 15 years, and I just became a U.S. citizen. My parents were both public servants. One worked for the banking regulator, and the other one was a community college professor. They both studied in the U.S. Before I became interested in engineering and computer science, I've been interested in politics and policy sort of all my life. And I arrived at engineering through a kind of process of elimination, in part because of talent and inclination. And so I had some talent at physics and math, and I wasn't really very good at anything else in STEM. If I could wave a magic wand at age 15, I would probably have gone to pre-law and law school, but it was as you may know, it is difficult to move internationally with a law degree, and I have to keep my options open given the increasing economic crisis in Venezuela, as well as the increasing authoritarianism of the government. And so I started a bachelor's in electronics engineering. I actually initially was a CS major, but I switched out of computer science because I was pretty underprepared compared to the other people in my undergraduate class. And I thought at the time that my strengths in physics would help me in an electronics engineering major rather than computer science. Unfortunately, a few years later, after I was basically done with the coursework, I realized that I didn't really like electronics engineering. And so I spent a year at Lund University where I wrote in Sweden, it was the equivalent of master's thesis. And then for my undergrad, it was the engineering thesis on simulation and modeling of a brake pedal. And I still use a lot of the skills I learned at that time in modeling the internet. So between my undergrad and grad school, I spent 2 years on a ship. I have finished my main degrees in 2010 and 2020, which is really impeccable timing in terms of the job market. And so I just had one option in 2010, and of course I took it on seismic exploration ship. About 60% of that job was engineering, and then 40% was like what you can imagine you do on working on a ship for weeks at a time. And even though I was pretty set on going to grad school, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. So I applied pretty broadly to programs in mechanical engineering, systems engineering, public policy, and some interdisciplinary programs. Eventually, I landed at an interdisciplinary program at MIT that's called the Technology and Policy Program. It was a good way for me to square the personal interest that I had in public policy with the formal training I had in engineering, which is hard to do in an undergraduate degree. And I spent, a couple of years doing research kind of part-time and really improved my credentials. And even though I didn't start the master's program thinking that I would apply to PhDs later, I really enjoyed research. So I So I did. I'm the first person in my family to get a PhD, so it just wasn't something that I thought about very much. And the same group that I worked on during my master's ended up being the group that I wrote one of the major papers with during my PhD. And we're almost done with this section. The main presentation in terms of my research will be about the work that I completed during my PhD and postdoc. I will only mention here this terrific book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. There's very few books that have had an impact to this scale in my life. It really showed me like the pervasiveness of surveillance, both by governments and large companies. And after working for a bit at a large tech company myself, I realized that protecting privacy is not really a priority of tech companies, but I didn't have enough time to explore this during my PhD, so I did a postdoc at Northeastern University. And that's how I kind of got here, right? Like one of my collaborators in the online privacy project is faculty in computer science here, and we're still collaborating today. So what you came here for, my research presentation. So we all know that the internet is a really, truly historical technological revolution. It has changed how we work with remote work persisting. It has changed how we learn, with some degrees being fully online and students never setting foot on campus. And it has even changed the operating room, with examples that are both awe-inspiring and terrifying of surgeons operating from hundreds of kilometers away. This idea may seem quaint now, but for about a decade, there was this hope that the internet would help in the expansion of democracy. So in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, several revolutionary movements, liberation movements, use internet technologies to organize themselves and become more effective. However, the situation that we're faced with today is not a situation where the internet is enabling liberation. Instead, it is allowing states to attack both human security and freedom. And there's countless examples about this in recent years. Here I'm showing just a few to paint a picture of how broad these phenomena are and how diverse the countries where it happens is. So we have everything from LGBT repression in Egypt to a military coup in Myanmar 3 years ago. So why is this happening? Why is the internet enabling surveillance and repression instead of liberation struggles? So we have to remember that companies that operate networks are subject to the same pressures from the market and regulators that companies in any industry are subject to. And in particular, the internet is actually a decentralized collection of about 70,000 autonomous networks. How resilient these networks are and how impacted they are by surveillance pressures from the government or large tech companies actually depends on the jurisdiction and the laws of that jurisdiction. And we now know that internet companies have very strong incentives to earn money, increase their revenue based on observing the activity of users on the internet. Now, you may think that, and tech companies certainly use this argument, that the harm being done is very limited compared to the advances and the productivity increases and so on that are enabled by these technologies. However, the harms actually can be quite severe. It is hard to overstate how much repression and loss of civil liberties have been enabled by the internet. And at a more individual level, unintentional disclosure of sensitive information with online targeting can lead to pretty severe consequences in a person's life. For example, an advertisement revealing that a person is pregnant or is a member of the LGBT community can result in both legal penalties as well as losing family ties. So how do we go about revealing the features of the internet that enable all of these serious harms? So my research is at the intersection of the technology that runs the internet, as well as the public policy that influences it. And in practice, this means working in two fields, the field of computer network security and privacy, as well as the field of public policy. I use a combination of computing methods, primarily the large-scale measurement of the internet and analysis of the network structure, as well as translating policy specifications to the structure of the internet and vice versa. And in order to broaden the impact of this work, I often engage with operators to do both surveys and interviews. There are lots of harms and in lots of places. So I've focused on a number of areas over the years. The work that I've completed during my PhD and postdoc is on the resilience and policy of the Global South. That's what of the internet in the Global South. That's what the majority of this presentation will be about. And I've also done some work on internet policy in the United States. I'm currently working on the impact of big privacy law in the EU, as well as the privacy of voice assistants. And in the future, which is something I've already partly completed at this stage, I'll be working on access to the internet by marginalized groups, as well as how voice assistants can enact a form of discrimination known as algorithmic discrimination. And due to time constraints in this presentation, I will be focusing on these areas that I've highlighted here. So the first research question that I will talk about today is, which countries have the most centralized networks? So you may ask yourself, what is a centralized network? If you are a user connected to the internet, you normally will contract either directly or either with your knowledge or not with an access provider. And so that includes universities as well as large commercial companies such as AT&T and Comcast. However, the content that you want to access is not really hosted by AT&T. The information you really want is hosted or resides in one of the companies at the top, most likely, Facebook, Microsoft, or Google. And in order to get from the bottom of this graph to the top of this graph and vice versa, we need a way to connect these two types of networks. These agreements between networks can be classified in two broad categories. The first one is the direct connectivity between networks, which is known as, in technical terms, is known as peering agreements. Or you can have indirect connectivity where a centralized transit provider will connect your network to the rest of the internet. Now, if you focus on the orange oval here, you will find that level 3 has some capabilities to operate on traffic that's flowing towards this university. It may be able to observe unencrypted traffic and metadata, and it may also be able to selectively disrupt connections on both ends. Now, disrupting the connectivity of a small, medium-sized university, in the US is one thing, but if level 3 were the main provider of every network in this, every access network in this graph, every network at the bottom, then level 3 can have a lot of impact over millions of users. And this is exactly the situation we find that a lot of countries in the Global South are facing, where there is a centralized transit provider that has enormous capabilities over traffic flowing towards the users in that country. The resilience of this intermediate layer is really not well understood today. We have lots of work. The vast majority of computer networking literature is focused on content networks. These are data centers, large-scale web services, and other types of networks that serve the network operators that own large volumes of content. There's also a smaller but still pretty sizable amount of work in access networks in terms of, for example, network outages and performance issues. There's almost no recent work on transit networks. So why is this the case? the United States, the European Union, and most of the global north have a network that is decentralized. Transit is no longer the main way in which networks connect to each other. And because researchers are primarily, computer networking researchers are primarily based in the global north, and the funding agencies that support their work also primarily support work on the global north, that's where the networking research is focused. And transit is really not that relevant in these regions anymore. And so through my studies, which I've run with my collaborators, both faculty and students, we found that there are many countries around the world where the centralized model is still the prevailing way in which networks connect to one another. And in order to confirm these findings and increase their impact, I have surveyed more than 100 operators in 19 countries around the world, and I also presented this work in Spanish at the Latin American Network Operators Group. So what are some of the challenges that we face when we want to study network centralization, especially in the global south? The first main challenge is that connections between networks, even though they have an enormous impact on individual users' connectivity, resilience, and privacy and security, these connections are secret agreements. And we can only ever reveal active links between access networks and content networks. The available data has much better coverage in the global north because that is where the measurement infrastructure is based. We have no existing map of which networks are present in each country, and we also have no approach to quantify how centralized a country's infrastructure is. There's some existing work on network centralization, but it is focused on primarily the centralization of either the global internet, which, because the US and the EU have such large networking infrastructure, if you quantify the centralization of the global internet, you will, in practice, be quantifying the centralization of the United States and the EU. There's also some work on the centralization of network connections that serve a single network provider, but obviously that doesn't generalize to the centralization of a whole country. So how do we go about studying this given these significant challenges? We start from the insight that there are two constraints that help us make the problem much more tractable. And the first insight is that if you are a user in Ethiopia, you actually don't need to access content in Ethiopia only. You also need to access content that is stored in other countries. And in practice, the majority of the content that you want to access from Ethiopia is based elsewhere because content providers are only based in a handful of countries around the world, primarily in the global north. The second insight is that in many countries, there are a handful of transit providers that connect the entire country to the rest of the world. And so revealing these bottlenecks becomes a much smaller problem. What we want to know is whether a country is more centralized or less centralized, because as we discussed earlier, a more centralized country is more vulnerable to observation and disruption. And so we would like to place each of the countries that we're studying on a spectrum that goes from the most centralized scenario, where a single transit provider connects the country to the entire internet, to a much less centralized scenario where there are multiple alternatives, in this case 3, to access content in the rest of the world. And these are fairly close to the real topologies, the real network structures of Ethiopia on the right and Turkey on the left. In concrete terms, we need a framework to infer the network centralization at the country level. And this framework that I designed has 3 steps. Due to time constraints for this presentation, I will only talk about step 3, but I will now briefly describe the first 2 steps. So first, we need to identify countries that still rely on transit providers, countries that are still centralized on the model that used to prevail everywhere on the internet, but that the global north has kind of abandoned in the past 15 years. Then, because data about the internet is so biased towards the global north, we need to confirm that these countries are actually centralized on transit by collecting our own data at large scale and confirming this with network operators in the countries that we're studying. And finally, once we know that a country is centralized on transit providers as a class, we need to identify which transit providers are most central to each country and then quantify the centralization on that specific network. So the outcome of the first two analysis steps and the large-scale experiments that we conducted is that there are 75 countries around the world where the prevailing model for international connectivity is to rely on centralized transit providers. These countries in aggregate represent about a quarter of the world's internet users, or 1 billion people. So we know now that these countries are centralized still on specific transit networks. But recall that you may rely on transit providers, but you actually have a multitude of options. And so these countries on the left here, on the left side of the spectrum, are in a much better position than the countries on the right. And we would like to determine, using a quantitative framework, where on the spectrum is each of the countries that we identified still relies on transit. In order to do this, we leverage the insight that in order to reach the internet, you need an IP address. And IP addresses are a limited resource that is unlikely to be assigned spuriously or go to waste, particularly in the global south, where IP address assignment is facing serious equities. There's many more IP addresses in the United States than there are in most of the countries of the global south, even in countries that have bigger populations. So if the topology, the network structure of Ethiopia or Turkey was this simple, then this would be over pretty quickly. Unfortunately, the real internet is considerably more complicated. And there are three principal sources of complexity. The first source of complexity is that there are many networks in each of these countries. And so in this picture, I'm showing 16 access networks. Even a small country such as Bolivia will have more than 70 networks and more than 800 network prefixes. The second source of complexity is that network operators, for a variety of reasons, decide to announce their IP addresses at various granularities. And so we have prefixes that are contained within other larger prefixes. And obviously, we can't count any IP address twice if we want to ensure that we're quantifying the centralization of the country as a whole. The third source of complexity is that a transit provider can actually serve multiple networks, and an individual access networks, therefore, may have multiple transit providers. Transit providers themselves also have transit providers that connect them to the rest of the internet. And we need to somehow factor all of this in quantifying which are the most centralized transit providers in each of the countries that we're studying. So in order to deal with these sources of complexity, we need a framework that can filter and analyze the approximately 1 million IP blocks that exist in the world, or 300 million routes. The key principles of the quantitative framework that we designed is that if a network is serving more IP addresses, the network is therefore more central to that country. A network that connects very closely to users is also more central to that country. And finally, networks that are observed along more routes are also more central to that country. And the tool that came out of this set of principles is a metric that quantifies traffic that flows through specific transit networks. This metric, at its core, quantifies the fraction of each nation's IP addresses that are served by a single network. And so we have each of the transit providers on the left may carry traffic towards approximately 1/3 of the IPs in Turkey, whereas the network on the right may carry traffic towards every IP in Turkey. This translates to a metric value of 0.33 for each of the transit providers on the left, or 1.0 for the transit provider on the right. And the country-level transit influence metric, which is what we call our metric of network centralization, is proportional to the number of IP addresses served by each transit provider divided by the number of IP addresses that are in total present in each of these countries. And in formal terms, this metric quantifies the exposure of a country's inbound traffic to observation and selective disruption by specific transit networks. So what do we find when we apply this metric to the 75 countries that still rely on transit? On this graph, I'm showing the country-level transit influence of the top 5 networks that are present in the 15 most centralized countries. That's on the horizontal axis. In these countries, the top network carries traffic towards a majority of the IP addresses that are located in that country. It is perhaps not too surprising that most of these countries are on this list because they're either island or landlocked nations. And so physical limitations are likely a factor in getting content from other countries. And in all of these 15 cases, the top network or the most influential transit provider has a much higher CTI than the second ranked network, which indicates that the country is very centralized and very reliant on that top provider. When we zoom out from the top of the distribution and we look at the entire distribution, we find this box plot here. We have the country-level transit influence metric for each of the top-ranked AS, that's the first box, the second highest ranked network, the third highest ranked network, and so on. And what we find is that there's still quite a high degree of centralization. If we looked at the country-level transit influence of the top transit network in each of these countries, we find that the median is greater than 1/3. So that means that in a group of countries that represents 1 billion users, the median case has a single network carrying traffic towards more than 1/3 of the IPs or more than 1/3 of the devices in that country. I'm also showing some examples of particularly centralized or particularly decentralized network structures in the countries that we studied. So we have cases such as Cuba and Ethiopia, where there's a state-owned mandated monopoly, and this policy obviously leads to greater centralization. There's other examples such as Chile and Bangladesh that have a more flat distribution of CTI values, these two lines here at the bottom, and that tells us that they are less centralized, and we actually find evidence to this point, still anecdotal, that they have public policies that lead to this decentralization. And so in terms of positive impacts on policy on network centralization, we have Bangladesh, which diversified its international routes by increasing the number of international gateway operators that were allowed to operate in the country. And we have the case of Chile, where the government mandated that all local traffic stay domestic, forcing every network carrier in that country to interconnect with each other, especially at a centralized connection point known as PIT Chile. So now we know anecdotally that policy has some impact on centralization, both positive and negative. So more broadly or more systemically, how does policy in these countries interact with network centralization? We know that there's a lot of state-owned companies that dominate in some countries. For example, in my native Venezuela, the ecosystem is dominated by CanTV, which is a state-owned provider. There are some challenges in systematizing this knowledge. The first and most obvious challenge is that we don't know which companies are owned by the state. And the second related challenge is that a single conglomerate owned by the state may have multiple transit or access networks. So far, we've been talking about centralization on a single network, but now we have to think about how to quantify centralization on multiple networks. And so our solutions was to produce a database of every internet provider around the world, and then to modify our CTI metric to evaluate the influence of network conglomerates rather than individual networks. And finally, in collaboration with political scientists in Germany, and this work was just published 2 months ago, we use multivariate analysis to find patterns in state ownership between countries. So what do we find when we study network centralization on state-owned providers? In this chart, I'm showing the 41 countries where a state-owned provider operates. In orange, we have the share of the access market, the share of the broadband and cell phone providers that connect real users to the internet that is owned by the state. And in blue, I'm showing the share of the transit market that is owned by the state. And so the first thing that we notice is that there's a lot of countries on this chart, and the majority of the countries in our sample have a state-owned access or transit provider. The second thing we may notice is that there is a spectrum of state-owned companies. And so on the left of the spectrum, you have countries such as Portugal and Colombia, where the state-owned companies are pretty marginal. And you have other countries at the end of the spectrum, including Yemen and Libya, where the state essentially owns the entire internet. And if you want to access the internet, you need to go through these companies. For me, the most interesting part of this chart is some of these middle cases, where it seems like the state actually doesn't control a large share of the access network, but it actually has a big share of the transit provision. And anecdotally, we noticed that autocracies are very common in this group of countries where the state provides a significant share of transit, but not as significant a share of access. One of these countries is Uzbekistan, where the government mandated that a new network would be the transit provider of a lot of cultural and educational organizations. Another country from this group is Myanmar, where Myanmar Post and Telecom, a state-owned company, was disrupted by the military during a relatively recent coup. These companies, Uzbek Telecom and Myanmar Post and Telecom, show high values of country-level transit influence, but low values of access provision in those countries. So far we've been talking about individual countries. What happens when we zoom out and we compare democracies to autocracies in terms of their provision of transit and access by state-owned companies? We find that in autocracies, the state is significantly more likely to provide transit, but there is no difference between access providers when it comes to ownership by the state. In democracies, there is no difference between ownership of transit providers between state-owned and privately owned companies, but the private sector is significantly more important when it comes to access provision. And what we conclude from these findings is that authoritarian governments seem to prefer controlling the internet through transit. Transit gives autocracies a still comprehensive and sophisticated means to control the internet, but it's much less observable than access networks, because I know of very few people who wake up every day thinking about Level 3. It's a company in the United States that most people have not heard of, but most people have heard of their access provider. And so in autocracies, that is also true. Access providers are very well known, but transit providers are relatively unknown. However, transit providers may still allow for the monitoring and disruption that autocracies need in order to extinguish liberation struggles. So to summarize this section of the presentation, we find that there's high network centralization in many countries around the world using the country-level transit influence metric. State ownership of internet companies is very common, particularly transit providers in autocracies. Now, I want to discuss some of my work that is not yet published, but that I have completed a significant portion of. And this is about online privacy in the European Union. Why do EU regulators care about where the servers that store user information of Europeans is located? They care about this because the location of servers allows for data exfiltration or data observation by either the governments in the countries where those servers are located or third parties that infiltrate those servers. And so data localization is a policy that places limits on the location of servers and aims to restrict the ability of both state actors and commercial companies to access user data of Europeans. So in concrete terms, we want to know whether these laws are working. Do privacy laws impact the location of web servers? And the GDPR is by far the biggest privacy regulation that enacts data localization in its text. The GDPR requires every country in the EU 27 to ensure that the data of the users in those countries is stored either in the EU itself or a very small number of third parties that are trusted for this purpose. And in order to quantify whether this law is working, I developed a method to audit compliance with this requirement. And it uses a familiar mix of large-scale network characterization, as well as the analysis of data from networks and related public policy provisions. We find that companies mostly comply with these requirements, but there's some exceptions that may be caused by the physical proximity of foreign servers. And I'll be talking about these exceptions later on. So how does this work in practice? If you access, for example, Amazon.de from Germany, you will not just receive responses from Amazon.de, but actually you will receive responses from a lot of servers that are owned by Amazon, which are actually storing the information that you want to access. And some of these servers may not be located in Germany. We have some hints in the name of the servers that they may be located in the United States or somewhere else in the world. And in some cases, we plainly don't know whether the server is located in the EU or not. So in order to audit this compliance at scale, we must know which domains are relevant to EU users because those are the domains that they will be accessing. We must then know where these domains are hosted, but in order to know where those domains are hosted, we need the relevant IP addresses of those servers because, as I showed in the previous slide, it is not possible to know where a web domain is located by simply looking at it. The key technical challenge is that the server that responds to a web request varies by location. It depends on which network you use to connect to the internet, as well as where that network is located. It's not possible to physically travel around the European Union to collect this data by hand, as appealing as that sounds. And there's no existing internet measurement platform that allows for the collection of all the data that we need. And so our solution is to virtually collect this data from the United States using multiple measurement platforms in the European Union and then intersect their findings. Let's go into more detail about how this method works. So we have a platform in the European Union that allows us to determine which web pages are being accessed, both directly by users, as well as any other pages that are loaded by that initial page. And so if you load Amazon.de, you will get Amazon content, but you will also get a lot of external content, for example, from advertisers. And so we need to know which servers, which domains are relevant for each of the European Union countries. Then from a separate platform, we identify which IP address and which physical location that IP address corresponds to. This second platform allows us to do these network measurements, but it doesn't allow us to virtually load web pages, which is why we need the combination of both platforms. And in order to audit compliance, we iterate over more than 1,000 networks in 20 countries using both platforms simultaneously. In practice, we fetch each domain from the proxy service, and then we reveal which server IPs are relevant to that service. And finally, we infer where the server is located using additional measurements from platform B. So what do we find when we apply this admittedly fairly convoluted networking methodology? Almost every server is located either in the EU or a GDPR compliant country. And so here I'm showing the percentage of servers that are located in a non-compliant location that are accessed by users in each of the countries in the European Union. We find that more than 95% of servers are located in one of the approved countries. And as much as we would like to believe that tech companies are following the law out of the kindness of their heart, we find a possible technical explanation as well. Regulatory pressure can lead to reputational damage and fines, and we're seeing that the fines in the EU are getting bigger and bigger to the point where they can't easily be ignored anymore. And also, if you want to increase performance of your website, you want to get the contents of that website to the user as quickly as possible. And the easiest way to do that is to locate the server in close proximity to the user. And so what we find is that technical goals may align with policy goals in this case and encourage companies to follow the policy. The exceptions are significantly more common in Eastern and Southern Europe. And let's talk a little bit about those exceptions. The United States is by far the most common destination outside of the broadly allowed countries. 90% of the servers that are located in not broadly adequate locations are in the US, Russia, and Turkey. The US is observed as a destination from almost all EU sources, and this is not surprising. The majority of the large tech companies that are popular in Europe are based in the United States. However, Russia and Turkey are a little bit less obvious choices. And in these two cases, we may find examples where for a user in Finland, if you're a website that's delivering content to a user in that country, and you want to deliver that content as quickly as possible, the fastest server may be actually located in Russia. And that may also be true for Romania and Turkey. And so on the fringes of the European Union, Russia and Turkey may offer better performance and therefore encourage companies to not follow data localization principles. So to summarize, privacy laws do have an impact on where web servers are located, and we developed a methodology to audit this compliance. We find that data localization is largely followed, but the exceptions are still pretty interesting and include primarily servers that are located in the US, Russia, and Turkey. And we plan to engage with operators and EU data protection authorities. So far, I have covered the online privacy aspects of my work, as well as the network centralization aspects of my work. There are additional lines of inquiry that I have started as a faculty member at UC Davis. The first one is the internet access by marginalized groups, particularly in the United States. And the second direction is on algorithmic discrimination by voice assistants, especially Amazon's Alexa. So why do we care about internet equity? The COVID pandemic revealed that for many people, internet access at home is either unaffordable or unavailable. And for these marginalized groups, the best option may be to access the internet at a public place, which includes a diverse set of organizations such as fast food restaurants or public libraries. In order to determine whether these users are being adequately served by their network providers, then we need to characterize internet access at community institutions, not just individual residences. Institutional networks, such as schools and libraries, often are the main point of connection for marginalized groups, for example, in rural areas or tribal communities. We know very little about these networks, as the majority of research has focused on residential broadband. We have some anecdotal evidence and scale studies that suggest that a lot of these networks are not very well served. And this underserving or this underprovision of networks can have very serious consequences, such as the expansion of inequities in critical areas. In the United States, the federal government has allocated tens of billions of dollars to improve the connectivity of households in the country. The current initiatives explicitly exclude community institutions, and so there's a very real possibility that the most vulnerable populations will get the least amount of support, and in many cases, they will get zero. So we propose a method that characterizes connections at community institutions. This method has three core components. The first is to identify where these networks are. The second is to measure whether these networks are complying with requirements of resiliency and performance. And the third component is to provide recommendations to operators and regulators on which networks to upgrade and how to go about upgrading them. This proposed work, which is under submission at the NSF, includes a combination of network techniques, data-driven techniques, as well as the validation with our partners in lobbying and network operators. In particular, we're working with the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, which is an organization that aggregates hundreds of community anchor institutions in the United States. The second direction that I have pursued since starting as a faculty member is algorithmic discrimination by voice assistants. We know that among consumer devices, voice assistants pose a particular privacy risk because they capture our voice, not just a transcript of what we're thinking. Ongoing work revealed that targeting users happens based on Alexa's interactions with those users, which is something that Amazon used to deny, and the cause of a class action lawsuit filed against them that cites our study. We also suspect that there may be discrimination based on the proprietary algorithms that voice assistants rely on, because these same algorithms have shown to be discriminatory in other contexts, such as in web search. The two research questions that I am exploring at the moment is, are there differences in voice assistant behavior based on income, race, or gender? And which policies are effective at mitigating privacy harms and discrimination? And we have preliminary evidence at this point that voice assistants are actually relying on the voice of the user rather than just a transcript of their voice, which is what now they're claiming they're doing. And so we're seeing differences in targeting based on the user's gender, for example, with female users getting more ads related to childcare and male users getting more ads related to employment opportunities. However, to expand this from the current scale, we will require more experimentation in voice assistants and related networks to reveal these potential harms. So to conclude my presentation, I use a combination of empirical characterization of networks with policy analysis. And this combination has allowed us to reveal properties of the internet that are driven by policy. We find that in the Global South, the internet is very susceptible to mass surveillance and disruption. And we find that, especially in autocracies, internet provision is centralized by transit providers. We also find that imposing jurisdictional constraints on the locations of servers may be an effective way to regulate the privacy practices of large tech companies. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. And I apologize for the Northeastern University label. Missed that before.
Thank you so much, Alex. This was a fantastic talk. Very impressive. So do we have questions? Questions? I think that Titus has one question.
Yeah, I suspect I know the answer, but I'm curious about the impact or I'm not sure what the right word is. So there are increasing numbers of ways to access the internet via satellites, and I'm curious, what fraction of the traffic is that, and how does that impact sort of the censorship and monitoring?
That's a good question. And so that's come, I think, under increased scrutiny because of the conflict in Ukraine. And so there was all this controversy about whether Starlink was going to provide nodes or not. And so the answer to that is that satellite links can actually be an effective way to circumvent censorship, because it's not possible, or it's not as easy for regulators to insert a transit provider in the middle if the connection is directly to a satellite. I think in practical terms, it is a censorship evasion technique that is primarily available to the elites in each of these countries as of now because of its cost. But we definitely see that satellite technologies are becoming more prominent. In some countries, they actually connect networks to each other. So in Central Africa, the main link outside of the country is through a satellite link. Because the properties of those links are becoming better. They're faster, so they have lower latency, and they're more performant with higher bandwidth. So I have not looked at satellite links yet, but I probably will have to eventually.
Yeah, and I'm curious then also in terms of, I've just forgotten the names, not VPNs, the proxying techniques that are used to evade, the first thing that comes to mind, sorry, I just got back from a trip, is when you're trying to evade regionalization by Netflix and you sign up for, I think, a VPN in another country, and then you like tunnel your traffic to there. Does that kind of encrypted tunneling and proxying, is that available to a lot of people? Is that something that people know how to do? The communities I'm part of online are all aware of it, but I'm a techie, so I don't know if that stuff's available to people who just use their cell phones for everything, for example.
Yeah, so the circumvention of censorship using networks has been around for a while. And so the more sophisticated sensors, such as the Great Firewall of China, have basically managed to devise new filters that catch almost every case. And if they suspect that something may be going through a VPN, they just block it. They just don't let it through. I think in less sophisticated autocracies like Ethiopia or Venezuela, many users do get around that circumvention using these techniques. However, the bad news is that the Russian government has designed this censorship boxes that are placed very, very close to the user. And they are very quick and they're very cheap. And it's going to become a lot harder to evade censorship once these boxes are widely deployed. And so those are like the two big exporters of surveillance tech, China and Russia. And it's a race, right? It's like the anti-censors against the censors, and there's no static there's no static point. It's always changing. But you hinted at another important thing, which is that it requires a level of sophistication by the user, which is not something that we can expect even of the majority of activists, right? Like this is going to be a privileged minority that's able to use these tools. Let's see, Mike has hand.
Yeah, I had a question related to that or similar. I also say I really like to talk and impressive work. The way a lot of the people I know who identify as activists kind of go about these things is using things like Signal, so different messaging apps. Could you speak a little bit to the role of just using a different app?
Yeah, so that's kind of related to the censorship circumvention issue, which is that the most sophisticated autocracies have found ways to deal with this. For example, they require the app stores not to carry Signal in those countries, or they entirely block push notifications, which is something that China is apparently about to do. And so the race to use circumvention technology on the device is always facing new obstacles by the sensors because you have a motivated and sophisticated enemy essentially on the other end. However, it is true that sometimes journalists and activists are able to get around the censorship using such technologies, but the windows are closing as the sensors become more sophisticated.
I had another question,
Okay.
which is why I have lowered my hand. But if anyone else has a question, I'm happy to wait too.
Yes, go ahead, Mikey.
The other question I have is on your work related to Alexa, in the sense that you mentioned that in Europe a lot of legislative tools are being leveraged and are even getting to the point where the big companies can't ignore them anymore for fines and whatnot. In terms of applying these types of methods in the US for companies like Amazon or others that might not be entirely as honest as one may hope, is that something that you see being plausible in the
Yeah, so the impact of the jurisdiction on the behavior of voice assistants is still a kind of open question. So there's some evidence from previous work that it matters. So for example, they found that voice assistants in the US were more likely to misactivate than voice assistants in the UK, which at the time was covered by GDPR, and then they enacted their own version of GDPR, so it's essentially still covered by GDPR. Misactivations are a big privacy risk because if you're not actually talking to the voice assistant, then it's still recording you and uploading it to the cloud. I don't know whether the EU behavior is becoming universal for voice assistants. I do think that the EU is large enough that it is encouraging better practices universally because it is pretty expensive to have multiple types of platforms to serve your core requests. So like your domain name system, your BGP routes and so on. But we still see a lot of evidence that the surveillance by voice assistants is expanding, not declining. And that's in part because Alexa has been losing money since it was launched, and the companies are now trimming the fat. And part of that means making Alexa more profitable, which means surveilling more. And so I think the best days of Alexa surveillance are still ahead of us.
Victoria, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Alex. Great job. Thank you.
Hi, Victoria.
This is way outside of my area of expertise, so these might be some simple questions. But when you talk about policy and public policy relevant to all of these areas, is it generally local in the sense of like national policy, or is there international or perhaps multinational policies that really are looking at this kind of at the bigger scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. So mostly we have been dealing with national policy. The unfortunate reality is that the regulators are very far behind. And with the notable exception of the EU, they're mostly not doing anything. And so the international organizations kind of take their cues from the national governments, especially the big, powerful ones. And so, I spent the summer in the ITU, for example, and the stuff they regulate is like fairly tame. Like it's like SMS compliance and technical standards. And there's a strong tendency to hide advances in surveillance capitalism as technological advances. and this is not, it's not like the regulators are stupid and they can't see it, is that by the time the regulators have caught up, then those markets have become a lot less profitable. And so we see that, for example, with search, right? Like the law is finally catching up with algorithmic discrimination and so on. And now the tech companies have moved on to voice and large language models and ChatGPT and so on. So I do think that in the US, the situation has gotten pretty dire with the healthcare policy changes that we saw last year. And so there was a kind of frantic struggle to remove capabilities to track menstrual cycles, for example, by some states. And so most of the action that we see in the US is actually happening at the state level. So Illinois, for example, has regulated voice records directly. California has a pretty comprehensive suite of privacy regulations. So there's this new one coming out where you can request that all of your information by any data broker is deleted if they're based in California, and most of them are based in California. So it's grim, but maybe trending positive.
I appreciate the optimism. I had one other question though around the discrimination and voice assisted technologies. How does that work on an income basis? I get where it would come from sex and perhaps race, but how does that happen with income?
So there's even less work about that. But what we know is that the privacy defaults are bad, right? And defaults are very sticky. And so there's this slightly unrelated case where the federal government is suing Apple and Google for I think it's like $5 billion a year that Google pays Apple to be the default search engine. And then they're like, no, it doesn't matter what the default is. And it's like, okay, then why do you pay them $5 billion a year? Clearly it matters. And so defaults are very sticky. And when you get your new phone, it may have privacy configurations that are very lax, right? It allows a lot of surveillance. And users that have higher income obviously also tend to have higher education levels, but they also have more free time. And so they're more likely to go through like their Facebook page and like toggle the privacy buttons off or on, depending on what it is. I suspect that people in poverty are surveilled at really, really aggressive rates. Similarly to how gambling addicts are surveilled in the casino, right? I suspect that the surveillance is much worse for lower income groups.
Really impressive work. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Victoria.
More questions? Do we have more questions? Thomas?
Yeah, so thank you, Alex. This is both interesting and, as Victoria suggested, a little frightening. But in what's also maybe disappointing is the frightening part of it is something that I don't think is a surprise or wouldn't be a surprise to a lot of people. And yet, as you suggest, that the regulators or the will to do anything even here in the United States is pretty wanting. So two questions. One is maybe you covered the three different things you're working on, and just like looking at that and all the things that I do, which pales in maybe comparison, you're doing three different huge projects, or you're talking about them. Are you do you just divide your time into thirds, or is like there's some kind of like is there something at a kind of meta level that helps you kind of learn from one that allows you to do the other, or are you just amazing at time management? And then the second one is kind of related a little bit to what I think Micah was getting at about the enforcement mechanisms of the GDPR. I've been following a little bit closely the dispute between the Apple App Store, for example, and the EU, and the fines that the EU has available to them. As you suggested, it was like in billions of dollars, like based on their global revenue. But I'm not sure, like, I don't feel like Apple is really quaking so much in their, virtual boots about the enforcement power of the EU. What's your take on their ability to impose these fines on companies like Apple? Is it a lot of talk, or does it seem like they actually do have some merit?
Yeah, so I think the fines used to be small enough that it was like the stocks of those companies actually went up when the fines were imposed, because it's like, oh, this is a joke. They have been getting progressively bigger, and I think there's an increased appetite in the EU, perhaps in part because their tech companies have not managed to reach the prominence that the US companies have. So there's a kind of a self-serving attitude towards harming these American companies that may make their own companies more competitive, at least in Europe. So that's one thing that's more speculative, but I suspect it's happening. I'm not super familiar with the details yet, but the EU is now looking to regulate each company individually. And so they have named 6 companies as essential service providers, and that includes like Apple and Google and Amazon and so on. And so they will create tailored regulations to the markets that those companies operate in. And I think that's more likely to work. I mean, we'll see. Like the problem with this is that you have regulators on the one hand, which I mean, in Europe, they're fairly well paid and better staffed, but they're still nowhere near the Silicon Valley resources, right? And so part of what's happening at the country level there is that they're getting flooded with lobbying funds, which they don't really have the infrastructure to deal with. They're only scrambling now to regulate it. And so you're seeing a copy of essentially what happens in the US, where the surveillance companies are usually among the top lobbyists in the United States, right? Like even ByteDance, who owns TikTok, is often among the top lobbyists in terms of contributions. And so I have some hope that things will get better because the EU is getting more sophisticated, but it's grim just because of the scale of these companies. And then to the first question, so up until this year, I did have a lot of overlap in tools and in methods, right? So I use internet measurement primarily, and it's not something that I was familiar with before the beginning of my graduate career, but eventually, over several years, I built enough of a repertoire of tools that then I could like apply them to multiple problems. And so it wasn't like reinvent the wheel each time. I am facing a situation now, though, where my lab is just growing too quickly and I don't know what to do. But I mean, it's a good problem to have, but I definitely will need some new management techniques to learn.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I was getting a little worried for you, but hopefully there's a technology solution.
Yeah, actually, I have a thought for you, Alex. I work on DNA sequencing data, and I've maybe gone a little too overboard on this, but I've devoted a lot of time and effort in my lab to building the internal infrastructure, the internal software that we use, and making that reliable and robust, so that when new people come into the lab, they're not starting from a janky set of code that virtually nobody else can use except for the author. They're starting from something that has some documentation and some and tests, and at least they can build off of. Now, I market this as me producing software for other people to use, and that is to some extent true. But honestly, the biggest impact has been of me devoting time and effort to building software in the lab has been that the other people in the lab can actually use it. And then I get a lot of my ideas for across projects from implementing something for one project. Then I'm like, oh, this could be used over here. So you could double down on software development. I'm hesitant to suggest that as a winning strategy, but it is fun in the sense that developing software can be fun. So and you can market it to to funding agencies, especially if you're a computer science professor, which I am not. But
Yeah, that sounds like something I will probably need to do in order to survive this long term. Yep. So I'll reach out and we can chat more. I would appreciate it.
over heavy drinking is
Yeah.
my current career stage requirement. But yeah, happy to chat anytime.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions or comments? No, I think now we are done. Then, Alex, this was just, I'm telling you, fantastic talk. You are so smart, my goodness. So it was very, very, very nice to learn from you. Well, thank you and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.